Bread rises, beer bubbles, wine ferments. Pizza dough transforms from a sticky lump into something airy and alive. And behind all of that, a tiny organism most of us never think twice about. Yeast is everywhere, in our kitchens, our history, even floating invisibly through the air around us. We use it constantly, yet few people can clearly answer a simple question. What exactly is yeast? Is it a plant? A bacteria? Is it alive? And how can something so small have such a massive impact on human civilization? Today, we're going to slow things down and really look at yeast. What it is, how it works, why it matters, and how this microscopic organism quietly helps shape the modern world right here on History of Simple Things. Let's start with the basics. Yeast is alive. That alone surprises a lot of people. Yeast isn't a chemical ingredient or a powder that magically reacts. It's a living organism. Specifically, yeast is a single-celled fungus. Not a plant, not an animal, not a bacterium. Fungi live in their own biological category, and yeast is one of the simplest members of that family. While mushrooms are fungi you can see and touch, yeast is microscopic. Each individual yeast cell is so small that millions could fit on the head of a pin. Yet despite its size, yeast eats, breathes, reproduces, and responds to its environment, just like larger living organisms do. So how does yeast actually work? Yeast survives by feeding on sugars. When it finds sugar, whether from flour, fruit, or grains, it begins to consume it for energy. But unlike humans, yeast doesn't need oxygen to survive. Instead, yeast uses a process called fermentation. During fermentation, yeast converts sugar into two main byproducts: carbon dioxide and alcohol. That's it. That simple process explains a huge part of human food culture. The carbon dioxide is what makes bread rise. Gas gets trapped inside dough, forming tiny bubbles that expand as the dough bakes. Without yeast, bread would be dense and flat. The alcohol is what gives us beer, wine, and spirits. In brewing, the carbon dioxide often escapes while the alcohol remains. In baking, the alcohol burns off in the oven, leaving behind flavor but no buzz. One organism, two byproducts, thousands of years of human creativity. Here's the wild part. Humans used yeast long before we knew it existed. Ancient civilizations brewed beer and baked bread thousands of years ago, but they had no microscopes and no idea what fermentation really was. To them, it looked like magic. Dough rose because it was alive. Beer fermented because of divine forces. Ancient Egyptians are among the earliest known bakers and brewers. They reused bits of old dough to start new batches of bread, unknowingly passing yeast from one loaf to the next. This technique, now called a starter, is still used today in sourdough baking. It wasn't until the 17th century that scientists even saw yeast for the first time under a microscope. And it took until the 19th century for Louis Pasteur to prove that fermentation was caused by living organisms, not spontaneous chemical reactions. In other words, yeast was shaping civilization while remaining completely invisible. When people say yeast, they're usually talking about Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the species responsible for most bread, beer, and wine. But yeast isn't just one thing. There are thousands of yeast species, living in soil, plants, water, and even on your skin. Some are helpful, some are neutral. A few can cause infections under the right conditions. Different yeasts behave differently. That's why beer yeast isn't the same as bread yeast, and why wine yeast is carefully selected to match specific grapes. The yeast you choose directly shapes the taste, texture, and aroma of the final product. Yeast doesn't just make things rise or ferment, it creates flavor. As yeast feeds on sugars, it also produces hundreds of tiny chemical compounds. These compounds create the subtle notes we associate with bread crusts, beer complexity, and wine aroma. That's why slow fermentation often tastes better. Giving yeast more time allows it to develop deeper, richer flavors. This is why artisan bread, aged beers, and fine wines are prized. In many ways, yeast is less like an ingredient and more like a collaborator. You provide the environment. Yeast does the work. Flavor emerges from the relationship. Yeast doesn't need mates or seeds to reproduce. It uses a process called budding. A tiny copy forms on the side of the parent cell, grows, and eventually breaks off to become a new yeast cell. Under the right conditions, this happens fast, very fast. In warm environments with plenty of sugar, yeast populations can double in a matter of hours. That's why dough suddenly balloons after doing nothing for a while. It also explains why temperature matters so much. Too cold, and yeast slows down. Too hot, and yeast dies. When you bake, you're not just cooking. You're carefully managing a living population until the very last moment. Of course, yeast isn't always helpful. In the human body, certain yeast species can cause infections if they grow out of balance. These infections are usually harmless and treatable, but they remind us that yeast is still a living organism responding to conditions. In food, unwanted yeast can spoil products, creating off flavors or excess gas. That's why fermentation is all about control, encouraging the right yeast while keeping everything else out. Yeast is powerful, but it's also sensitive. In a world of instant everything, yeast teaches patience. It reminds us that some processes can't be rushed. Flavor takes time. Transformation happens quietly. Progress is often invisible until suddenly it isn't. Yeast connects modern kitchens to ancient ones. It links science with tradition. It turns simple ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. And all of it happens at a scale too small for the human eye. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.